Hello and welcome. I'm Izzy at Minerva. In today's video, we're looking at how to fit our very own Minerva Exclusive Jane sewing pattern. This is a lovely, stretchy jersey little dress, and it is actually reasonably straightforward to fit. So if you've bought the pattern and you're looking at just refining the fit slightly, this is the right video for you. We love to support your sewing journey here at Minerva, so we've also created 2 other videos which will support you as you sew our gorgeous Jane sewing pattern. We have a fabric focus video which talks all about the different types of fabric that we would recommend for this pattern, what would work really well, and that's available on our YouTube channel. And we also have a sew along, so despite there being a lovely booklet with loads of gorgeous instructions really clearly laid out and explained, we also have a gorgeous little sew along. So if you get stuck on any sections, you can also refer to that. But as I said, this video is just looking at fit, so let's do that together. Let's take a look at the instruction booklet because it is really helpful for fit. So this is the instruction booklet, and it obviously has a lot of information before we hit the information about the fit, so do read through that first. So in terms of fit, let's look at the actual garment. So what we've got going on here, we've got a nice rounded neckline which is dropped down from the top of our neck. The armscye is brought in towards the neckline, it's not hitting at the shoulder point. And it has a nice raised armhole which gives you a nice element of modesty around the armhole and bust area. The rest of the garment has a lot of ease around it. Around the waist and the hips you can see that there's a lot of space there, so it's a really comfortable fit. Now it does go into a lot more detail down here, where it basically just says that the garment has been designed to be loose and billowy, and you can expect about 21 centimetres of ease around the bust and about 33 centimetres of ease around the hips, which just means you're going to get a nice comfortable cocoon shape with loads of ease in this dress. The pattern does also have some gorgeous integrated pockets around the hips, and it is designed to be knee length. Now, on the size chart on page 8 and 9, you can see that the pattern has been designed with 2 different size ranges, the misses and the women's size. Now, what is happening with these 2 is that we have the larger size in the women's size. You can see the hips here are going up to 157 centimetres, whereas on the smaller size range, the hips only go up to 111 centimetres. So that's the first point. When you're looking at which size to cut, that's your first reference point. Are you going to be cutting from the misses size or the women's size? But also the pattern accommodates 2 different cup sizes. So this is a cup size B and this is a cup size D. Now this is not the same as your bra cup size. What this is looking at is the difference between your full bust and your high bust body measurement. So the misses size range assumes that you have 2 inches or 5 centimetres between your full bust and your high bust body measurement. And if you're cutting the women's size range, you're going to be cutting a D pattern cup size, which means that the difference between your full bust and your high bust is more like 10 centimetres or 4 inches. And I will talk you through how to take those measurements in a minute. Let's take a look at this in practice. I'm now going to go and show you how to take your 4 critical body measurements in order to ascertain which size to cut. And then I'm going to do a little example demo to show you which size I would choose based on a set body size of specific body measurements, so you can follow along at home and use those principles to decide which size you need to cut out. In order to measure our body, we need to do 4 body measurements for this particular pattern. The first one, if you grab a tape measure, is up and over and around the top bit of your bust. So underneath your armpits, and nice and snug under there, and it is a circular measurement all the way around your body. Pop 2 fingers between the tape measure and your body. Take a big breath in and out again, and just make sure you can run those 2 fingers around and between your body and the tape measure. Take that measurement. The next measurement is our bust measurement. So this is our full bust measurement. And now this one is going around the widest part of our bust, and again it should be in a nice straight line around our back as well, and we should be able to fit 2 fingers between our tape measure and our body. Take a big breath in and out again and just take that measurement. Now our waist is in between our ribs and our hips, and if you bend to one side you should be able to find a natural sort of kink in your body on both sides as you bend. Just try and find where that break is in your body, and whatever that is, grab a tape measure and wrap that around that part of your body, just making sure that it's definitely in the right place. And again, big breath in and out again, and make sure you can run 2 fingers between your body and the tape measure. Now the final one is our hip measurement, and that is usually around 20 centimetres below our waist. It is the widest part of our body between our waist and the floor though, and for everyone that will be somewhere slightly different. So it's around 20 centimetres, but what you're trying to make sure is it's going around the widest part of your body, and you can wiggle the tape measure up and down like really snugly at the widest part, but so that you just make sure you're definitely getting it at the widest section. You obviously then can run 2 fingers between the tape measure and your body and just check that you've got that correct. Now in this example I'm going to assume that these are my body measurements that I'm working to, and I want to work out which size to cut. Now on this particular example the hips are 156 centimetres. I'm going to start at my hips and then go up. So on the size chart we haven't got an exact 156 centimetres. You can see that I'm sitting most closely to this size, size T. Now I'm 1 centimetre less than the size for T, but I'm closer to size T than I am to size S. It's much closer to the T. So I'm going to be wanting to cut out the size T for my hip area. The next one is my waist, which is 130 centimetres. Now again, the closest size category that I fall into is the S size. So I'm going to size down for my waist to an S. And for my bust, I'm going to take my high bust measurement first, which is 128 centimetres, which is sitting really close to the 129.5, which is the R pattern size. And my full bust measurement is 140 centimetres, which is fitting really nicely into this size here. So we can see that my bust, waist and hips are all 3 different sizes. Of course, if your body fits really nicely into one size range, you can just cut that straight size really simply. However, if, like in this example, you've got a couple of different sizes that you need to cut between your bust, waist and hips, we can grade the pattern pieces between those 2 sizes to ensure that it fits you perfectly, and that is the joy of sewing your own clothes. And I'll show you how to grade in between sizes in a few minutes. The other thing to notice is that we obviously have this lovely little finished garment size chart right here. And at this point here, you can see that when the garment is finished, the volume of fabric around the hips is 185.5 centimetres. Which just means that you've got loads of extra volume around the hips and the garment is definitely going to fit you. And around the bust size, again, once we cut out that particular size that we need, it's a size R, we're going to have a lot of extra volume around the bust area too on our finished garment. If you feel like this amount of extra volume around the bust, waist and hips is just a bit too much and it's a bit too baggy, you can of course size down using the finished garment measurement chart here to make sure that you're going to fit into the garment and maybe that it just fits a little bit more snugly. The final thing that you're going to note is that both patterns are designed for the same body height, which is 5'6" or 167 centimetres tall. This is incredibly common. It's the average height of a woman in general. And of course you've got to start somewhere, but if you need to lengthen or shorten the pattern piece because you are taller or shorter than 5'6", then I will also show you how to do that in the fitting demo to come. Okay, so we've looked at how to measure our body, we've looked at how to pick our pattern size, but what we want to do now is just to show you how to grade between sizes. Now in this particular example, we're going to be looking at a bust area of a size R, a waist of an S, and a hips size following the T size on the pattern. So let's take a look at these pattern pieces just so that we can understand where our bust, waist and hips are, and then I can demo how to grade between sizes. So in front of me here we've got the front pattern piece, which is pattern piece A. Let's take a look at that first because it's got some really helpful guides on it. So to start off with, you'll know and you'll realise that this is supposed to be a knee length sort of dress. So your knee level is going to be around here. We've also got an approximate hip level, which is at this point here on the pattern, and an approximate bust level with the notch right here. So you know that's where your bust is going to be. These two little guides of the hip and the bust are going to be really helpful in determining how you grade between sizes. So in this example, the hips, I want to cut a size T. Now as we can see in this little chart down here, the size T is the largest size, so I'm looking for this graphic here. And I know that this is my hip level. So I'm going to take my ruler and all I'm going to do is just extend out that line to where I know that my T line sits, which is here. And then I'm just going to trace along that size. So I know that's the line that I want to cut for this particular pattern. Okay, so my hips down need to be the size T, but by the time I hit my waist, it actually needs to be one size smaller, which is a size S. So the waist, well, where is the waist? The waist is usually approximately 20 centimetres above the hip level. This is an approximate, and obviously you can measure your own body and get it more accurate. So here we go, 20 centimetres above the hip is around here, and that will be approximately where your waist is. So once again, at that point, I'm just going to square it off and mark on S. That's where I want to be, so one size smaller by the time I hit the S size. And so really then, I basically just want to draw a line between the two, but just make sure that it's not too angular when it hits this section up here. So just sort of soften it off and curve it off as it hits that wider and bigger line. Now the next thing we want to do is the bust. So we've got this lovely little notch here which tells us where our approximate bust level is, and for the bust I'm cutting a size R, which is the third line in. It's this graphic here, so it's this one right here. So by the time I hit the bust, I want to grade it in one more size. So very simply, we're just going to do the same thing, join those two dots up together. Okay, and then from the bust level on, we're just going to cut our size for the bust. So just continue tracing along that line of the R. Perfect. So we've graded between the R, which is up here, the size S for the waist, and the size T for the hips. So there you go, we have now done the first piece and we graded the first pattern piece. Let's take a look at the other pattern pieces and just annotate where the bust, waist and hips are where relevant, so that you can know where to grade between on each pattern piece. So the next pattern piece we're going to look at is B, which is the upper side front. So this side of the pattern piece is going to match up with this side of the pattern piece here. Now immediately you're going to notice that you've got a notch there, and that will marry in with this pattern piece on A, and you've got this other T-shaped notch which is here. Now brilliantly, this is where our bust is. So we can annotate this one just to say that's the bust. And then this notch represents and allocates and will line up with this one here. Now if you grab your pattern drafting ruler, you'll notice that for us our waist was approximately 9 centimetres above that. So if you then mark a point that is 9 centimetres above that notch right there, you can just write here waist. That's a starting point. However, our grading lines are actually on this side of the pattern. So using our grain line as a reference, I'm going to line up my pattern drafting ruler here so it's nice and straight and parallel with the grain line, and then I just want to mark a point over here as to where the waist is on this side over here, and the same for our bust line here. And then we just need to work out where our hips are located. So they're 11 centimetres below that dart. And that dart is going to tie in with this dart, so 11 centimetres below, that will be where our hips are. and our hip was going to be the size S. So once again, you just draw a smooth line between all of those. Great, so that's pattern piece B finished. If we look at the two final pattern pieces on here, we've got pattern piece E up here, which is our neckband. Now our neckband is going to be cut out in the size of our bust, because from our bust upwards, we're just going to cut our bust size. So our neck is above our bust line, so that's why we're going to cut that. So for me, it's going to be the R size. Again, the armhole is above or around our bust area, so we can just cut the bust size for that too. And for me, it's that one and that one. Okay, let's move on to the next sheet. The next pattern piece we're going to look at is pattern piece C, which is our lower side front. So on the pattern booklet, that is effectively this pattern piece right here. So the bottom is the hem, and then this flat bit is folded under to create the pocket piece. It's folded along that line. Okay, so in order to be able to understand where our key reference points are on pattern piece C, we also need to have pattern piece A in front of us. So this pattern piece is going to be attached along this side here to this side over here on the pattern piece. So these two notches here are going to line up this one here and that one here and that one there. They're all in the same sort of reference space. So this one is going to line up with that one. So if we want to know where our hip is, we need to measure the distance between the approximate hip level and that notch there, which is about 11 centimeters. So working on this pattern here, from this notch here, mark a point 11 centimeters above, and you can just write that that is the hip notch. Send that reference straight across once again, and that becomes our hip. Now for us, I'm following the size T for the hip, so I'm just going to trace from the hip all the way down on the size T, and then I know that that's the pattern size that I need. Now you'll notice on this pattern piece, between the hip and up to the waist area, which is here, we're grading between one size. However, this pattern piece effectively stops where that notch is because this whole section is folded down and under. So really, you can see that this distance is almost half from the hip up, isn't it? So what I would tend to do if I then knew I was grading up or down to a different size at the waist, would be that I would just sort of grade it halfway between the two lines, the two size lines that I'm aiming for. And then I know that approximately by the time it hits this size here, it's going to be around there, isn't it? So it's going to be hitting in at about that point there, which marries up with the grading line that we have here at this point. Mark the distance from that notch up to your waistline, which for me is about 7.5 centimeters. Mark that distance along here, 7.5, and then you know that that's where you need to grade back up to. And then continue with your hip size for the rest of this pattern piece. Let's move on to the back pattern piece next. So this is pattern piece D. So I'm going to lay my front pattern piece over this back pattern piece here, lining up the hemline down the bottom, because the hemline is going to be straight across the bottom of the garments. That's a really nice reference point. Transfer your bust, waist and hip lines from pattern piece A onto the back pattern piece as shown. And there we have it, how to grade between sizes across all the pattern pieces. Okay, the next thing we're going to look at is how to lengthen or shorten our pattern piece. So let's get straight into that now. So the pattern has been designed for someone who is 167 centimeters tall or 5'6". So if you're considerably taller or shorter than that, then you may want to consider lengthening or shortening your pattern pieces to ensure proportions are working well for you. So if we take a look at the fitting guide in the instruction booklet, you can see that the dress is supposed to hit you at knee length. But if that's not happening for you and the garment is lower or shorter than your knee length, you're going to know that you're going to need to alter your pattern in order to ensure it hits your knee beautifully. Now, where you choose to do that is completely up to you. If you feel like you have a longer torso, then you're going to want to lengthen the top bit from the waist up. If you feel like your legs are longer, then you're going to want to lengthen the pattern pieces from the waist down. So it might be fitting really nicely across the bust and to the waist, but then around the hip, the volume isn't in quite the right place and you need to raise it or lower it in this area. So in this demo, I'm going to show you how to shorten the pattern pieces, but obviously the principles would apply if you were lengthening them. You'd just be adding volume rather than removing it. I'm also going to assume that we're going to do the changes around the hip area because that's slightly more complicated on this pattern piece. If you want to lengthen or shorten your pattern piece from the waist up, you can very simply just shorten or lengthen across the bust area. But down at the hips, we've got the pocket area to play with, so let's take a look at that in a bit more detail. So I've got pattern piece A, which is the centre front pattern piece, and pattern piece C, which is the lower side pattern piece. The reason why I've got these two pattern pieces is because we want to lengthen it or shorten it from the hip area. So the first thing I'm going to notice is that on the pattern piece we have got the pocket fold line. So let's just do that now. Okay, so that's now folded under. So we're now going to raise the hip up slightly in order to shorten the whole garment. So I'm going to use a really simple reference point in order to simplify the whole process. I'm going to say that my approximate hip level is here. And this is the point where I want to raise the pattern. So all I'm going to do is use my approximate hip level line here, and I'm just going to draw a line straight across both pattern pieces. Cut along both those pattern pieces. Don't forget to leave the pocket as it is and only cut along this line, because we want the pocket size to remain the same on this pattern piece as it will for the side front top pattern piece. Okay, great. So now we've got those two pieces separated. I'm going to assume that we want to raise the pattern piece by 3 centimetres. So I'm going to draw another line which is 3 centimetres parallel to the original line I drew on both pattern pieces. Next, take your pattern piece and just very simply drop it down so that it's sitting nice and level on that new lowered line. What you want to make sure for the front pattern piece is that the centre front line remains completely straight across both pattern pieces, and the same for this pattern piece. And I'm just going to line up the grain line on the pattern piece to make sure it's beautifully lined up. Now, when you fold this back down, the pocket length has not changed because it's not been altered in any way, which means that when we get pattern piece B and it's attached in, it's still going to match up beautifully when we line up the two pattern pieces. Great, let's move on now to do the back pattern piece. Okay, so I've got the back pattern piece here, pattern piece D, and I've lined up pattern piece A, so the centre front and centre back are matched up beautifully, and the hemline at the bottom is aligned. And then literally just draw a line straight across at the hip line, straight across pattern piece D. We want to do this cut and this alteration at exactly the same point on the back as we do the front. So once you've drawn that line, then just cut it out. Mark your 3 centimetre offset, line your ruler up so it's running along the centre back nice and straight, and then just line up the two pattern pieces so they overlap beautifully just like that, keeping the centre back nice and straight because that will be cut on the fold. Brilliant, and that is how you lengthen or shorten, and in this case shorten, the back pattern piece. The next change we want to have a look at is the sway back adjustment. So this affects the back of the garment. Now this is obviously very loose fitting on the model here, but what would be happening if we had a sway back adjustment would be that we'd be getting a lot of fabric sort of just pooling at the base of the bum here at this point here. So it's all sort of gathering here, and there's just too much fabric in this area of the model. So in this demo, let's assume that we need to remove 3 centimetres of fabric from the centre back. That's the amount that we've pinched out of the garment as we wore it. So I've got my back pattern piece here, and this is the only pattern piece that we need to look at to do this alteration. So the first thing we need to know is where the waist is on the pattern piece. I have annotated on this pattern piece the approximate waistline, and that is between the bust and the hip, about 20 centimetres above the hip line. And then just draw a line straight across from the pattern piece. Now at the waist, I then want us to draw another line, which is 3 centimetres below our waistline. Next, mark a 1.5 centimetre offset from the side seam, and that denotes where the stitch line is when you sew the garment together. Using a pair of scissors, cut from the side seam into that little cross that you've just marked, Then cut all the way along the rest of the line from the centre back to the seam allowance point, leaving a pivot point where the seam allowance is. And now what we want to do is, using that as a pivot point, we want to be removing the volume from the garment at that waist point. So we're going to pivot the pattern piece until our centre back line meets that new 3 cm offset line that we drew along the centre back. Tape that in place again. Take a strip of paper and mark a nice long straight line along it. Place the piece of paper underneath your pattern so that the hem of the pattern piece down here and the neckline are touching that line that you just drew. Now what we've done is straighten up the centre back, which is brilliant because that pattern piece wants to be cut on the fold. But what it has done is that it has added volume at the waistline, and we don't want that extra volume. It's going to reshape the garment at the waistline, affect how the whole pattern sits on us. So we've managed to remove the sway back adjustment along the length of the body, but what it's resulted in is a 2.5 cm increase at the waistline. So over at the waistline here, I'm just going to mark a point that's 2.5 cm in of the side seam at the waist point, which is just there. And then just redraw the curve of the side seam so it matches up and ties in with the rest of the garment, just like this. And then just remove the volume with a pair of scissors. And of course, don't forget, if you've got any notches, just make sure you transfer them to your new side seam. And so the pattern piece ends up looking like that. So you can still cut along a nice straight line along the centre back on the fold. One of the alterations I want to talk you through today is if we have a gapping neckline. So here you can see the neckline sitting really nice and flat against the model. But sometimes what can happen with a garment is that you end up effectively feeling like there's like a lot of excess fabric around the neckline around here. So in that scenario, you can grab some pins, and what we can do is just sort of pin out the excess volume, and you want to pin it out at the neckline and evenly on both sides. So whatever you've taken out of that side from the centre front, you want to pin out the same amount on the other side. So it might look something like that, and then you can see that the garment is actually going to sit much flatter against the body of this particular model. So let's take a look and see how you would translate these changes onto the pattern pieces if you've got a gapping neckline. So what we've got here is our front pattern piece and our neckband, because these two pattern pieces will be altered. The first thing I want to do is to mark my seam allowance at the neckline, just in this little curve here, which is 1.5 centimeters offset. So working along that seam line, I know that I want to remove, let's say, 2 centimeters out of the neckline. So even though you may have pinned it down here or anywhere else along the neckline, we're going to be removing it from this point up here. So I've marked the 2 centimeter line at that point. I'm then going to mark my 1.5 centimeter seam allowance over here. Continue to mark the seam allowance down the neckline as shown. Then take a tape measure and just measure the length of that line from the centre front all the way up to your offset line. For me, it's exactly 17 centimetres. And basically what we want to do is keep the neckline measurement at 17 centimetres. But we just want to sort of bring it in slightly so that we're bringing in the whole of the garment. And this is just going to help it sit a little bit more comfortably along our neckline. We don't just want to drop the shoulders down, we want to bring the whole of the neckline in as well. So what I would recommend is that you bring it in 1 centimetre, maybe 0.5 centimetre. Just see what feels right for you. So just bring that tape measure in a little bit, and what you'll notice is it's actually going to raise the neckline up a little bit further. You still want your neckline to be 17 centimetres or whatever your neckline was once you'd removed the volume that you needed to. So just mark a nice little notch there where you want the top of your neckline to be, your new neckline, and then just use your pattern drafting ruler to create a nice new soft neckline. And that neckline should be approximately 17 centimetres or whatever it was for you. Then just mark in your new stitch line or seam allowance line, your block line, using a different coloured pen. pop a piece of paper underneath your pattern piece and just dash out your seam allowance, which is 1.5 centimeters offset from the stitch line. And that should hit your centre front line exactly the same as it did before, and it should just be nicely curved up around there. Now what we want to do next is to measure the length of the shoulder line at this point, from here to here. Mine's 7.5 centimeters. We want to draw a new shoulder line that is exactly the same length as the previous one. So for me, 7.5 centimeters, because it needs to tie in with the back pattern piece, which will be 7.5 centimeters, or whatever yours is. So for me, I'm just going to line up the top of my neckline with that 1.5 centimeter offset from the arm side line. And I'm just going to draw a line from the neckline seam allowance up, hitting that arm side line right there, which is 7.5 centimeters. And at that point there, you want to draw in a slightly new curved arm side to meet that point. Okay, so the final thing we need to do is make some changes to the neckline, because obviously that is going to need to be reduced too. Now, because this is a stretchy jersey garment, we are just going to keep this process really simple. We have effectively removed from the neckband up here that distance right there. So all I'm going to do is flip that round on its side, pop it up here, and just draw a straight line across to remove that volume from the neckband. Brilliant. We've now finished showing you how to do the common fit alterations you may need to do if you're sewing our gorgeous Jane dress sewing pattern. I hope you have loads of fun sewing that up at home and really enjoy the process. Thank you for watching today. I'll see you next time.